great presentation. Women and girls are 50% of the African population. Still, we only have about 26% of women in parliament in Africa, and only 5 out of 54 countries are in the top 10 of countries in the world with this percentage. We still have issues of education, issues of child marriage. Women still die when giving life to another person. Women are victims of violence, especially from their intimate partner. Women feed the continent, but do they really benefit from the economical part of it? There is a pay gap between women and men when we talk of work. We are talking of 50% of our population. And are we going to wait for 142 years before we have our rights respected, before we have more resources, before we are more represented in the decision-making processes within our countries? Yes, we have laws in place. They have been developed, but the statistics on gender are still worrying us in Africa. But how could the feminist development policy really help us to progress and make more impact on this aspect? And for this, we are going to invite Dr. Larissa, who is going to share her perspective on how the FDP could impact on public policies. As I said in the beginning, she is a lecturer. She is really passionate about women's rights, and she is actually working on the research project. Dr. Larissa Kojwe, you have the floor.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings. In my language, we said, Gachatawuawak. It means greeting, and we can add Puhamopok, Benchomopok. It means the road that leads you here, it's a good one, and welcome to this talk this afternoon. So thank you for your presence. I would like to thank the organizers of this space, and in particular, Mrs. Ka, whose leadership I admire the most among the political leaders in Cameroon. So it's a deep honor and privilege. Thank you. I'm also happy to meet Mrs. Jiponju, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've been asked to explain the difference between the gender mainstreaming approach and to identify its 2 or 3 major achievements or failures, and to underline the key differences between the gender mainstreaming approach to policymaking and feminist development policy. I'll also try to highlight some key changes that feminist development policy could bring in improving gender equality in general and in Africa in particular. So let's start by what is gender mainstreaming in policymaking? Gender mainstreaming was adopted as a major strategy for promoting gender equality at the 4th World Conference of Women in Beijing in 1995. It is an approach to policymaking that takes into account both women's and men's interests and concerns. Gender mainstreaming was adopted mainly to address the perceived failures of previous strategies, such as women-specific projects, to bring about significant changes in women's status. There was a consensus that the failure of women-specific projects in the 1970s and 80s was due to their marginalization. So gender mainstreaming was designed to overcome this marginalization and to bring gender equality issues into the core of development activities. In response to that, many development organizations, private donors, NGOs, took steps to implement gender mainstreaming policies. They set up gender units, they hired gender specialists and adopted gender training. That is also how gender enters university curricula in most of the universities, specifically in Cameroon. And that's also why we have so many gender experts today. We have gender experts, but not gender equality experts. So following Beijing conference, at different country level, governments established national women's machineries, charging them with responsibility for gender mainstreaming throughout government institutions and operations. A great deal of energy and resources went and are still directed into getting to the organizational culture right. I would draw some examples from a study that I co-led with Tade Yosa. It's a Cameroonian colleague. We worked on the gender mainstreaming in the case of Bachinga Tui Yoko Lena Road development. It is in Cameroon, one of the first road infrastructure to include specific activities for women. The project was done through the technical and financial assistance of African Development Bank, UN Women, and other partners. So the UN Women has developed specific projects entitled Gender Promotion and Women's Economic Empowerment along the Bachinga Tui Yoko Lena Road section. That project was ambitious. It aimed at strengthening women's economic capacity and reducing gender inequalities. Women warmly welcomed this new project. However, the critical analysis that we have done of the implementation of this project shows several limitations due to insufficient preparation of women and girls to seize the new opportunities that were offered. Also, an underestimation of the time needed because the project was just for 3 years, and also a certain rigidity in process and procedures. Specific activities for women did take place, and some women were able to benefit from the road project, but to a much lesser extent than was planned and that they could have benefited. Women were informed and they tried their best, but most of them didn't have the capacities to fully benefit. So at the end of the project, before even the end of the project, a lot of them went back to their fields or in the market. And unsurprisingly, during the project, the rate of unwanted teenage pregnancies also increased significantly, as did the rates of sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. And the project has not improved women's political participation either. So benefits of gender mainstreaming are far to be sustainable if they are limited in time, as is always the case. And instead, they seem to benefit people who already have privilege. The project should have been built on existing capacities and organizations instead of creating new organizations or new ones. It could have been extended to much more than 3 years, and it could have been more flexible in the way it engaged with women, especially in rural areas. The problem for me is you could help women here and there, you could put some women here and there, but if there's no commitment to gender equality goals and values, not just the rhetoric, there cannot be significant changes. Meaning if the power structure remains the same, then the change is only superficial. The way gender mainstreaming is understood is only about inclusion. It looks like a technical issue that does not lead to the qualitative change towards gender equality. It's about inclusion. It is not about transformation. And here is where gender mainstreaming differs from feminist development policies. So the second point of my talk is about the feminist development policy. What is it? Feminist development policy is a new framework in policymaking. It's a commitment to moving beyond traditional gender mainstreaming to a more holistic, intersectional approach that recognizes how gender relates to other forms of oppression, such as on the basis of class, of race, of ability, and sexuality. While the gender industry only wants more women in politics, the feminist development policy wants more feminist policies. I have no problem with more women in politics. We have a great project in Cameroon about that. But for me, I always wonder, what is the meaning of having more women in politics if those women cannot speak, when women are killed on a daily basis, when mothers lose their kids in a bloody war in Northwest or Southwest concerning Cameroon, when mothers that go to hospital cannot see their babies because of health inequalities. And what is the point of having all those women there if they cannot speak to power, if they cannot speak on women's rights? So that was just a bracket, okay? So while the gender mainstreaming approach has depoliticized gender inequalities, the feminist development policy repoliticizes it. This perspective tackles the root causes of gender inequalities in social norms and role models. It has the potential to disrupt the statu quo and potentially transform the very nature of the state. Feminist development policies enhance equality for people of all genders, and thus is to the advantage of the whole society, including men. Analysis shows that feminist movements are a powerful force against authoritarianism. Women's rights movement play critical roles in opposing militarism and strengthening initiatives for peace. We have concrete examples in DRC, in Liberia, in Somalia. And cross-national research finds that the presence of national feminist movement significantly increases the likelihood of ending violence against women through legal and policy reform. And it has greater effects than women's representation in parliament. So the feminist development policy centers women's life, but also promote a whole set of human rights for those who need it the most. Those whose needs are overlooked, ignored, and most of the time dismissed. In fact, the feminist development policies offers meaningful support to those at the forefront of addressing the structural drivers of inequality and other forms of injustice. And those people are autonomous feminist movements. Those movements target the rights of all underrepresented and marginalized groups, and therefore the feminist development policies is open to new ways of engaging with development. For example, in the feminist development policies, we make the distinction between general resources for gender equality and funding that supports women's rights and feminist organizations or movement. It's not the same thing. A recent report by Aurelie, some of you probably know that organization, it's Association for Women in Development. A recent report by Aurelie showed that 90% of money circulating for gender equality is not in the hands of feminist movements, despite claims that it advances gender equality. There is money, of course, but this money is missing. This money is missing the feminist movement and organization doing most of the transformative work. So embedding accessible and impactful funding to feminist movement into policy framework is a necessary starting point for governments that are serious about delivering on their promises and the much needed outcomes for gender equality. For me as a scholar and also as an activist, it is one of the most advanced tools ever conceived to reach those who need the most support, to shift the power and to redistribute wealth. But I know that in a context where women's rights activists are already often discredited as being westernized, this new approach is already being criticized for its Eurocentric vision, not only because of its broad scope and the discomfort it brings, but mainly because the terminology itself makes it marginal. The terminology, Feminist Development Policy. As a scholar navigating different women's rights spaces, I can tell how anti-feminists, some gender expert, some people claiming to be for gender equality, I can tell how anti-feminist they are, particularly in Cameroon. So we have gender equality experts that are advancing that are doing anti-feminist policies. Let me explain why, and also answer the question, does Africa need feminism? First, the resistance to feminism or feminist approach to development is often based on a combination of misunderstanding of this concept and unconscious biases that implicitly favor existing power dynamics and inequalities. The mere word feminism is highly contentious to many Africans, to many Cameroonians, and it's associated with Western imperialism, man-hating, lesbianism, so many things. And for some, yeah? And for some, it's easier and more efficient to simply bypass the term feminism to avoid distraction, etc. But for some of us, changing the terminology doesn't solve the problem of white global domination, and second, avoiding the name and using terms as gender sensitive, it's forgetting that gender itself, or the way we understand it, is also a Western construct. Haven't you ever questioned why we respect elders so much in our culture? That's because hierarchy was based on parenthood and seniority, not on gender as we are pretending. And third, refusing the term is to set ground on those who think feminism is a Western imperialism, while we know it's not true. Africa was a feminist land before the advent of feminism. What do I mean by that? I mean that African women in most African society, whether matrilineal or patrilineal, they were engaged in a agentic, self-determined, and typically collective advancement of their particular interests well before the term or the terminology feminism. Unfortunately, most of us, we don't know our history. We don't know that prior to the two major historic events that completely changed our ecosystem, we had bold grandmas, and I want to shout out to all the grandmas that are in this call. We had powerful queens, we had audacious entrepreneurs. And contrary to the contemporary narrative that we are so prone to defend in the name of tradition or African values, African women in pre-colonial periods featured important roles in production, politics, and religions. They were independent, controlled their bodies, owned their labors and finance, and they were able to determine their destinies. There are historical evidence that under the British or the French system, we are former colonial states, the colonialists only recognized and valued the authority of male chiefs and totally overlooked that of female chiefs. So there's a huge book. It's really interesting. I can share the link on the chat after that. It documents women's studies, African women's studies, women's stories. It's really beautiful. Before the 1900s, African society actually attempted to create gender equity. Our ancestors deeply believed that when one gender had too much power, society was out of balance, and that could lead to chaos. So with the shift from matrilineal descent to patrilineal descent in a vast majority of African societies, patriarchy has become the norm. But we all know that a patriarchal state requires gender inequalities to survive. So while we are defending a patriarchal system and fighting for gender equality, it cannot go together. Because patriarchy relies on gender inequality. Please give me 2 more minutes and I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
So feminist development policies, like the feminist perspective, speaks to power. It's not just about, okay, we will put some more women here, more women in politics, more women in the economy, more women here and there. Despite seemingly positive changes in the inclusion of women in policymaking and system of governance, the global system of power has not changed. We are still there. So there is a need, it has to change if we all want to thrive and live meaningful and decent lives, free of poverty, discrimination, and violence. So yes, to the question of does Africa need feminism, I will reply that the whole world needs feminist leadership. Thank you for attention. And sorry, I took long to explain myself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larissa, for these great points. Thanks to gender mainstreaming, we've been able to have gender integrated in our curricula. We have put a lot of energy and resources to mainstream gender in our institutions, to train our colleagues, to empower women, and especially in our project, what we noted from your point is that a lot of projects are being designed, but unfortunately, women are not prepared to seize the opportunities that we are giving. We have a lot of rigidity in processes and procedures, and at the end of the day, we don't have much improvement in women's political participation. We actually have to ask ourselves, are we reaching the right people? Are we not giving more opportunities to those who are already privileged? Do we have a quality change with the projects that we implement? And the feminist development policy is here not just to think about having more women, but really shifting the power and redistributing wealth. Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm sure our participants are going to comment and ask more questions at a later stage. And we want to build on your points to invite our next speaker, Ms. Evelyn Diponju, all the way from DRC. And we noted in the presentation of Alice that we have a lot of statistics worrying us in terms of gender in DRC. Evelyn has 26 years of professional experience and expertise in human rights and also in gender equality. She's really involved at grassroots level, as she is today a founding member of the organization Action pour la promotion de l'empowerment et le leadership féminin. She's really passionate about women empowerment and leadership. And today, she's taking her expertise to really be today a head of mission in DRC for a Swedish organization called Kvinna till Kvinna. So Evelyn, as a gender specialist, as a gender expert, as a feminist, you are working in development world for the past 20 years. With your experience, with your personal perspective, what do you think should be changing in the development world? How could the feminist development policy really shift in the cooperation between countries. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Aurélie. Bon après-midi à tout le monde. C'est un plaisir de pouvoir faire partie de ce panel pour pouvoir partager un peu mon expérience du féminisme tant au niveau africain qu'au niveau de certains pays comme le Cameroun et la RDC. Donc, j'ai préféré dans mon propos commencer par la base pour dire quels étaient les besoins exprimés par les féministes en Afrique, parce qu'il faut être clair. Larissa a un peu abordé cela tout à l'heure, mais il faut dire que l'Afrique dispose d'un grand, comment on dit ça, un grand groupe, un grand type de plusieurs mouvements féministes, existent en Afrique, que ce soit au niveau des pays ou encore au niveau de la région Afrique. Donc, le féminisme n'est pas seulement une idéologie qui nous vient de l'Occident, mais elle a été pratiquement africanisée compte tenu du fait qu'en Afrique, on vivait des situations et on vit toujours des situations un peu différentes compte tenu de nos traditions, de nos religions, etc. Donc, réunis à Accra en 2006, un grand mouvement de féministes africaines a décidé et a discuté et pris des résolutions qui ont été vendues pratiquement aux différents pays. Et parmi ces décisions-là, l'on peut relever le fait qu'elles ont proposé qu'en tant que féministes, elles placent le système patriarcal au sein de leurs préoccupations. Parce qu'effectivement, le patriarcat est le système où l'autorité masculine opprime les femmes à travers les institutions, qu'elles soient sociales, culturelles ou encore religieuses. Bon, religieuses de notre époque, parce qu'à l'époque de nos ancêtres, la religion était plutôt l'apanage des femmes. On pourra y revenir plus tard. Et elles ont aussi pris l'engagement de s'assurer que l'accès des hommes aux ressources et leur contrôle sur celles-ci dans les domaines publics devrait être vraiment une domination. On constate une dominance masculine au niveau de l'accès et du contrôle des ressources. On constate aussi qu'au niveau de l'espace, le système patriarcal varie tant au niveau de l'espace qu'au niveau du temps. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a des changements qui sont en train d'être constatés dans le temps et dans l'espace, que l'on se situe dans une localité ou dans une autre, et il y a des évolutions, il y a des changements qui peuvent être positifs, mais qui peuvent aussi être négatifs. C'est-à-dire on peut passer du pire au meilleur, tout comme on peut passer du meilleur au pire. Je vous informe que